Okay, so let's start with a bit of a puzzle. I'm going to give you three completely different stories, separated by decades, separated by continents. Your job is to try and figure out what in the world they have in common.
First up, it's the 1960s. The world-famous Smithsonian Institution is running this huge project, tracking the migration of seabirds all across the Pacific. It's pure science, just gathering knowledge for knowledge's sake. Or so it seemed. Now, let's jump back a decade to New Zealand. A really progressive new adoption law gets passed, and the whole idea behind it was to give children a totally clean slate, to legally create these perfect families by just completely cutting all ties to their birth parents. And for our third piece, let's come all the way to today. Right now, there's this sprawling, global online group. They hang out on platforms like Discord and Minecraft, and they groom and exploit vulnerable kids. But here's the twist. They're not after money. They're after chaos. So, what is it? A secret bird study, a well-meaning law, and a modern digital cult. I mean, on the surface, they've got absolutely nothing to do with each other, right? But they are all connected by this hidden blueprint, a pattern of how powerful systems, whether they're secret government programs or legal frameworks or even online networks, can create and then exploit vulnerability. And in this explainer, we're going to pull back that curtain and show you exactly how this pattern works.
So let's kick things off with the most straightforward example, the architecture of control, where government systems are built to operate in the shadows with, frankly, terrifying precision. And that brings us to the infamous Project MKUltra. This was the CIA's top-secret Cold War-era program to master mind control. It ran on what insiders called purely internal and compartmented controls, which is just a fancy bureaucratic way of saying they could do whatever they wanted with no oversight and no ethical boundaries. They were literally trying to find ways to create a reversible, non-toxic, aberrant mental state. In plain English, they wanted to control people's minds. And this wasn't just some wacky idea they were kicking around. It was put into practice. It was written down in manuals, like KUBARK, which was the CIA's official guide to coercive interrogation. But look at the goal here. It's not just about getting information. It's a scientific process to induce regression, to literally, psychologically, take a person apart piece by piece, to dismantle their identity until there's nothing left.
And the techniques they used show you just how systematic this was. This wasn't random brutality. It was a cold, calculated playbook. They knew how to weaponize the shock of being captured. They used sensory deprivation, knowing that if you cut a mind off from everything, it starts to create its own reality. It starts to hallucinate. They even noted that threats work best when delivered coldly, and that pain, if used too late, is actually a sign of desperation. This was the precise psychological deconstruction of a human being.
And we know this because of documents like this one, stamped Eyes Only Secret. It gives us a peek into this hidden world. It proves these weren't rogue operations. They were discussed at the highest levels, kept secret not just from you and me, but from most of the government itself. That right there is the architecture of control. Secret, unethical, and ruthlessly systematic. So, let's go back to those birds for a second. The public story? A simple scientific mission. But behind the curtain, the real sponsor was the U.S. Army. And all those academic reports on where the birds were going, they were being sent straight to Fort Detrick, the nerve center for America's biological warfare research. A completely public project was being used as a secret data gathering tool for the military.
But here's where it gets more complicated. This pattern isn't always driven by malicious intent. Sometimes the deepest harm comes from systems that were actually designed to help. Take New Zealand's 1955 Adoption Act. The promise was genuinely noble. Create a complete break to spare adopted children the stigma of being born out of wedlock. But the reality of that state-enforced secrecy was just devastating. It left adoptees in what they later described as a psychological no-man's land, completely cut off from their past, caught between the family they knew and the history that had been legally wiped from existence. This quote just nails the trauma of it. The law performed a violent birth cut. It severed people from their whakapapa, their genealogy, a concept that's deeply important in Maori culture. It left them with what psychologists now call genealogical bewilderment, a profound identity crisis created by a system that, with the best of intentions, denied them the right to their own story. And we see a really similar pattern when we look at the history of opioid addiction treatment. For years, methadone was hailed as this incredible success, and in many ways it was. The data showed it massively reduced illegal drug use and crime. But here's the thing. By focusing only on the chemical dependency of one person, the system was completely ignoring the world around them. It was treating only half the problem.
But the truly shocking part came when researchers started looking at the next generation. They studied the children of mothers who were in methadone treatment, and what they found was stunning. The prenatal methadone exposure itself, it had a pretty low impact on how well those kids did in school later. The single biggest factor by a huge margin was what they call socio-familial risk, things like poverty, the mother's own health, just general instability. The system treated the parent's addiction, but it did nothing to change the vulnerable environment the child was born into.
Okay, so a secret mind control program, a well-meaning adoption law, a life-saving medical treatment. You see it now? What's the hidden pattern that ties all of these things together?
This is it. This is the common thread. It's powerful systems, whether they are secret, legal, or even medical, that either create vulnerability or exploit the vulnerability that's already there. Sometimes the system is the cause of the problem. Other times, it's just really good at taking advantage of it. Either way, the result is the same.
And you can see the different faces of that vulnerability in all of our stories. You see it in the unwitting people used in MKUltra. You see it in the thousands of kids abused while in the care of the state. You see it in the adoptees who are legally cut off from their own identities. And you see it in families who are stuck in this generational cycle, where just treating one person's addiction isn't nearly enough to protect their kids from the high-risk world they have to navigate every single day. But here's the crucial part. This pattern isn't just something we dug up from the history books. It is evolving, right now, into new and, honestly, more decentralized forms of harm.
The opioid crisis is a perfect, tragic example of this evolution. It started back in the 90s with doctors overprescribing painkillers. Then, when the system cracked down on that, people who were already dependent switched to heroin in the 2010s. And since 2013, the crisis has been completely dominated by incredibly deadly synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Each wave created a more vulnerable, more desperate population for the next wave to prey on.
And this landscape of vulnerability is the perfect breeding ground for modern predators like the 764 group. This isn't some top-down state conspiracy. This is a scattered global network of people who just want to watch the world burn. They target vulnerable kids online, and their currency isn't money, it's clout, which they earn by making the most sadistic, horrifying content you can imagine. It is the exact same pattern of exploitation we've been talking about, just retooled for the digital age. You know, the CIA's mind control programs, New Zealand's adoption laws. These things operated for decades with their true impact completely hidden from public view. Once you learn to see this pattern of powerful systems creating and exploiting the vulnerable, it leaves you with one really crucial question. What hidden systems are shaping our world right now?